This is StoryLink Radio. The professional storytellers at StoryLink Radio have been around for a long time. The Irish knew storytellers by the name Shawnee. We are committed to bringing stories to life through the spoken word as in traditional oral storytelling. We present stories of many genres: ancient myths and legends, short stories, full-length novels, science fiction, high fantasy, philosophy, traditions, classics, drama, fiction, non-fiction, romance, theater, ghosts and haunts, stories of the strange, and much, much more. Our stories may be drawn from contemporary sources or from some dusty, near-forgotten tome. Regardless, it is a treat like no other to listen to stories and tales presented in a live format with the emotion and feeling a true professional storyteller brings, conjuring up images of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. So join us at StoryLink Radio and let us be your Shawnee for a time. Our stories are presented before a live audience, then recorded for the StoryLink Radio podcast for your on-demand listening pleasure. Please visit StoryLinkRadio.com for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Visit www.StoryLinkRadio.com. Tonight's story is The Stone Age by H.G. Wells. This is a story of a time beyond the memory of man, before the beginning of history. A time when one might have walked dry-shod from France, as we call it now, to England, and when a broad and sluggish Thames flowed through its marshes to meet its father Rhine, flowing through a wide and level country that is under water in these latter days, and which we know by the name of the North Sea. In that remote age, the valley which runs along the foot of the Downs did not exist, and the south of Surrey was a range of hills, fir-clad on the middle slopes, snow-capped the better part of the year. The core as its summits still remain is Leith Hill, Pitch Hill, and Hindhead. On the lower slopes of the range, below the grassy spaces where the wild horses grazed, were forests of yew and sweet chestnut and elm, and the thickets and dark places hid the grizzly bear and the hyena, and the grey apes clambered through the branches. And still lower, amidst the woodland and marsh and open grass along the way, did tonight's little drama play itself out to the end that I have to tell. 50,000 years ago it was. 50,000 years, if the estimates of the geologists are correct. And in those days, the springtime was as joyful as it is now, and sent the blood coursing in just the same fashion. The afternoon sky was blue with piled white clouds sailing through it, and the southwest wind came like a soft caress, and the new-come swallows drove to and fro. The reaches of the river were spangled with white ranunculus, and the marshy places were starred with ladies' smock and lit with marshmallow wherever the regiments of the sedges lowered their swords, and northward moving hippopotami, shiny black monsters, sporting clumsily, came floundering and blundering through it all, rejoicing dimly and possessed with one clear idea, to splash the river muddy. Up the river, and well in sight of the hippopotami, a number of little buff-colored animals dabbled in the water. There was no fear, no rivalry, no enmity between them and the hippopotami. As the great bulks came crashing through the reeds and smashed the mirror of the water into silvery splashes, these little creatures shouted and gesticulated with glee. It was the short sign of high spring. "Bolu!" they cried. "Bahaya! Bolu!" They were the children of the menfolk, the smoke of whose encampment rose from the knoll at the river's bend. Wild-eyed youngsters they were, with matted hair and little broad-nosed impish faces, covered, as some children are covered even nowadays, with a delicate down of hair. They were narrow in the loins, long in the arms, and their ears had no lobes, and had little pointed tips, a thing that still, in rare instances, survives. Stark, naked, vivid little gypsies, as active as monkeys and as full of chatter, though a little wanting in words. Their elders were hidden from the wallowing hippopotami by the crest of the knoll. The human squatting place was a trampled area among the dead brown fronds of the royal fern, through which the crosiers of this year's growth were unrolling to tie light and warmth. The fire was a smouldering heap of char, light grey and black, replenished by the old women from time to time with brown leaves. Most of the men were asleep. They slept sitting with their foreheads on their knees. They had killed that morning a good quarry, enough for all, a deer that had been wounded in a rutting fight, so that there had been no quarrelling among them, and some of the women were still gnawing at the bones that lay scattered about. Others were making heap of leaves and sticks to feed brother fire when the darkness came again, that he might grow strong and tall therewith and guard them against the beasts. And two were piling flints that they brought an armful at a time from the bend of the rivers where the children were at play. Now none of these buff-skinned savages were clothed, but some wore about their hips rude girdles of adder skin or crackling undressed hide, from which depended little bags, not made, but torn from the paws of beasts, and carrying the rudely dressed flints that were men's chief weapons and tools. And one woman, the mate of Uya the Cunning, wore a wonderful necklace of perforated fossils that others had worn before her. Beside some of the sleeping men lay the big antlers of the elk, with the tines chipped to sharp edges and long sticks hacked at the ends with flints into sharp points. There was little else save these things and the smouldering fire to mark these human beings off from the wild animals that ranged that country. But Uya the Cunning did not sleep, but sat with a bone in his hand and scraped busily thereon with a flint, a thing no animal would do. He was the oldest man in the tribe, beetle-browed, prognathous, lank-armed. He had a beard, and his cheeks were hairy, his chest and arms and black with thick hair, and by virtue of both his strength and cunning, he was master of that tribe, and his share was always the most of the best. Now, Eudena had hidden herself among the alders, because she was afraid of Uya. Eudena was still a girl. Her eyes were bright, her smile pleasant to see. He had given her a piece of the liver, a man's piece, and a wonderful treat for a girl to get. But as she took it to the other woman with the necklace and looked at her, an evil glance, and Ugh-lomi had made a noise in his throat. At that, Uya had looked at him long and steadfastly, and Ugh-lomi's face had fallen, and then Uya had looked at her. She was frightened, and she had stolen away while the feeding was still going on, and Uya was busy with the marrow of a bone. Afterwards he had wandered about as if looking for her. But now she crouched among the alders, wondering mightily what Uya might be doing with the flint and the bone. And Ugh-lomi was not to be seen. Presently a squirrel came leaping through the alders, and she lay so quiet the little man was within 6 feet of her before he saw her. Whereupon he dashed up a stem in the hurry and began to chatter and scold her.
"What are you doing here?"
he asked.
"Away from the other men beasts."
"Peace," said Eudena to the little man. But he only chattered more. Then she began to break off the little black cones to throw at the squirrel. He dodged and defied her, and she grew excited and rose up to throw better. And then she saw Uya coming down the knoll. He had seen the movement of her pale arm amidst the thicket. Uya was very keen-eyed. At that, Eudena forgot the squirrel and set off through the alders and reeds as fast as she could go. She did not care where she went so long as she escaped Uya. She splashed nearly knee-deep through a swampy place, and saw in front of her a slope of ferns, growing more slender and greener as they passed up out of the light into the shade of a young chestnut tree. She was soon amidst those trees. As Eudena was very fleet of foot, and she ran on and on until the forest was old and the trees great, and the vines about their stems where the light came were thick as young trees, and the ropes of ivy and stout and tight. On she went, and she doubled and doubled again, and then at last lay down amidst some ferns in a hollow place near a thicket, and listened with her heart beating in her ears. Eudena heard footsteps presently rustling among the dead leaves far off. Then they died away again, and everything was still again, except the scandalizing of the midges, for the evening was drawing on, and the incessant whisper of the leaves. Eudena laughed silently to think the cunning Uya should go by her. She was not frightened. Sometimes, playing with the other girls and lads, she had fled into the woods, though never so far as this. It was pleasant. It was pleasant to be hidden and alone. She lay there a long time, glad of her escape, and then she sat up listening. It was a rapid pattering growing louder and coming towards her, and in a little while she could hear grunting noises and snapping of twigs. It was a drove of the lean, grisly, wild swine. She turned about her, for a boar is an ill fellow to pass too closely on account of the sideways slash of his tusks, and she made off slantingly through the trees. But the patter came nearer. They were not feeding as they wandered, but were going fast, or else they would not overtake her. And she caught a limb of the tree. She swung onto it, and she ran up the stem with something of the agility of a monkey. Down below, the sharp, bristling backs of the swine were already passing when she looked down. And she knew the short, sharp grunts they made meant fear. But what were they afraid of? A man? Oh, they were in too great a hurry for just a man. And then, so suddenly it made her grip on the branch tighten involuntarily. A fawn started in the brake and rushed after the swine. Something else went by, low and grey with a long body. She did not know what it was. Indeed, she saw it only momentarily through the interstices of the young leaves. Then there came a pause. Eudena remained stiff and expectant, rigid, almost as though she was part of the tree she clung to, peering down. And then far away among the trees, clear for a moment, then hidden, then visible, knee-deep in the ferns, then gone again, ran a man. She knew it was young Ugh-lomi by the fair colour of his face, and there was red upon his face. Somehow his frantic flight and that scarlet made her feel sick. And then nearer, running heavily and breathing hard, came another man also running. At first she could not see, and then she saw, foreshortened and clear to her, Uya, running with great strides and his eyes staring. He was not going after Ugh-lomi. His face was white. It was Uya, afraid. He passed, and was still loud hearing when something else, something large with grizzled fur, swinging along with soft, swift strides, came rushing in pursuit of him. Eudena suddenly became rigid, ceased to breathe, her clutch convulsive, her eyes starting. She had never seen the thing before. She did not even see him clearly now, but she knew at once it was the terror of the woodshade. The terror of the woodshade. His name was a legend. The children would frighten one another, frighten even themselves with his name, and run screaming to the squatting place. No man had ever killed any of his kind. Even the mighty mammoth feared his anger. It was a grizzly bear, the lord of the world, as the world went then. Men in my very lair, fighting in blood at the very mouth of my lair. Men, fighting in blood, men. For he was the lord of the caves and of the wood. Long after Bob had passed, she remained, a girl of stone, staring down through the branches. All her power of action had gone from her. She gripped by instinct, with hands and knees and feet. It was some time before she could think, and then only one thing was clear in her mind, that the terror was between her and the tribe, that it would be impossible for it to descend now. Presently, when her fear was a little abated, she clambered into a more comfortable position where a great branch forked. The trees rose about her, so she could see nothing of Brother Fire, who was black by day. Birds began to stir about her, and things that had gone into hiding for fear of her movements crept out. After a time, the blue overhead deepened, and the taller branches flamed out at the touch of the sunset. High overhead, the rooks, who were wiser than men, went cawing home to their squatting places among the elms. Looking down, things were clearer and darker. Eudena thought of going back to the squatting place. She let herself down some way. Then the fear of Bob, the terror of the woodshade, came upon her again. While she hesitated, a rabbit squealed dismally, and Eudena dared not descend farther. The shadows gathered, and the deeps of the forest began stirring. Eudena went up the tree again to be nearer the light. Down below, the shadows came out of their hiding places and walked abroad. Overhead, the blue deepened. A dreadful stillness came. Then the leaves began whispering. Eudena shivered and thought of Brother Fire. The shadows now were gathering in the trees. They sat on the branches and watched her. Branches and leaves would turn to ominous, quiet black shapes that would spring on her if she stirred. And then the white owl, flitting silently, came ghostly through the shades. Darker grew the world and darker, until the leaves and the twigs against the sky were black and the ground was hidden. She remained there all night, an age-long vigil, straining her ears for things that went on below in the darkness, and keeping motionless lest some stealthy beast should discover her. Man in those days was never alone in the dark, save for such rare accidents as this. Age after age, man had learnt the lesson of its terror, a lesson we poor children of these have nowadays painfully to unlearn. Eudena, though in age a woman, was in heart like a little child. She kept as still, poor little animal, as a hare before it is started. The stars gathered and watched Eudena, her one grain of comfort. In one bright one, she fancied there was something like Ugh-lomi. She fancied it was Ugh-lomi, and near him, red and duller, was Uya. As the night passed, Ugh-lomi fled before him up the sky. Eudena tried to see Brother Fire, who guarded the squatting place from beasts, but he was not in sight. And far away she heard the mammoths trumpeting as they went down to the drinking place, and once some huge bulk with heavy paces hurried along, making a noise like a calf, but what it was she could not see. But she thought from the voice that it was Ya-ah, the rhinoceros, who stabs with his nose and goes always alone and rages without cause. Sounds like somebody else Dagmar might have dated. At last, the little stars began to hide, and then the larger ones. It was like all the animals vanishing before the terror. The sun was coming, lord of the skies. The grizzly was the lord of the forest. Eudena wondered what would happen if one star stayed behind. Then the sky paled to the dawn. When the daylight came, the fear of lurking things passed, and she could descend. Eudena was stiff, but not so stiff as you would have been, my dears, by virtue of your upbringing. As she had not been trained to eat at least once in 3 hours, but instead had often fasted 3 days, she did not feel uncomfortably hungry. Unlike Rick and I. She crept down the tree very cautiously, and she went her way stealthily through the wood. Not a squirrel sprang or a deer started, but the terror of the grizzly bear froze her marrow. Her desire was now to find her people again. Her dread of Uya the cunning was consumed by a greater dread of loneliness. But she had lost her direction. She had run headlessly overnight. She could not tell whether the squatting place was sunward or where it lay. Ever and again she stopped and listened. At last, very far away, she heard a measured chinking. It was so faint even the morning stillness that she could tell it must be far away, but she knew the sound was that of a man sharpening a flint. Presently the trees began to thin out, and then again came a regiment of nettles barring the way. She turned aside, and then she came to a fallen tree that she knew, with the noise of bees about it. And so presently she was in sight of the knoll, very far off, and the river under it, and the children, the hippopotami, and the river otters, just as they had been yesterday, and the thin spire of smoke swaying in the morning breeze. Far away by the river was the cluster of alders where she had hidden. And at the sight of that, the fear of Uya returned. She crept into a thicket of bracken, out of which a rabbit scuttled and lay a while to watch the squatting place. The men were mostly out of sight, saving Wa'u, the flint chopper, and at that she felt safer. They were away hunting food, no doubt. Some of the women, too, were down in the stream, stooping intent, seeking mussels, crayfish, water snails, playing with the otters, and at the sight of their occupation, Eudena felt hungry. She rose, and she ran through the fern, designing to join them. As she went, she heard a voice among the bracken calling softly. Eudena stopped. Then suddenly she heard a rustle behind her, and turning, she saw Ugh-lomi rising out of the fern. There were streaks of brown blood and dirt on his face, and his eyes were fierce, and the white stone of Uya, the white firestone, the firestone that none but Uya dared touch, was in Ugh-lomi's hand. In a stride, Ugh-lomi was beside her and gripped her arm. He swung her about and thrust her before him towards the woods. "Uya," he said, and waved his arms about. She heard a cry, looked back, and saw all the women standing up and 2 wading out of the stream. Then came a nearer howling, and the old woman with the beard, who watched the fire on the knoll, was waving her arms, and Wa'u, the man who had been chipping the flint, was getting to his feet. The little children, too, were hurrying and shouting now. "Come, come," said Ugh-lomi, and dragged Eudena away by the arm. Still she did not understand. "Ouya!" said Ugh-lomi, and she glanced back again at the screaming curve of figures, and dimly understood. Wau and all the women and the children were coming towards them, a scattered array of buff, shock-headed figures, howling, leaping, crying. Over the knoll 2 youths hurried. Down among the ferns to the right came a man, heading them off from the wood. Ugh-lomi left her arm, and the two began running side by side, leaping the bracken, stepping clear and wide. Eudena, knowing her fleetness and the fleetness of Ugh-lomi, laughed aloud at the unequal chase. These two were an exceptionally straight-limbed couple for those days. They soon cleared the open, and they drew near of the wood chestnuts again, neither afraid now because neither was alone. They slackened their pace, already not excessive, and suddenly Eudena cried and swerved aside, pointing and looking up through the trees. Ugh-lomi saw the feet and legs of men running towards them. Eudena was already running off at a tangent, and as he too turned to follow her, they heard the voice of Ouya coming through the trees and roaring out his rage at them. Then terror came in both their hearts. Not the terror that numbs, but the terror that makes one silent and swift. They were cut off now on 2 sides. They were in a sort of corner of pursuit. On the right hand and nearby them came the men, swift and heavy, with bearded Ouya, antler in hand, leading them. And on the left, scattered as one scatters corn, yellow dashes among the ferns and grass, ran Wau and the women, and even the little children from the shallow had joined the chase now. The 2 parties converged upon Eudena and Ugh-lomi. Off they went, with Eudena ahead. They knew there was no mercy for them. There was no hunting so sweet to these ancient men as a hunting of other men. Once the fierce passion of the chase was lit, the feeble beginnings of humanity in them were thrown to the winds, and Ouya in the night had marked Ugh-lomi with death word. Ugh-lomi was the day's quarry. They both ran straight. It was their only chance, taking whatever ground came in the way. A spread of stinging nettles, an open glade, a clump of grass out of which a hyena fled snarling. And then woods again, long stretches of shady leaf mold and moss under the green trunks, then a stiff slope, tree-clad, and long vistas of trees, a glade, succulent green area of black mud, wide open space again, and then a clump of lacerating brambles with beast tracks through it. Behind them the chase trailed out and scattered, with Ouya ever at their heels. Eudena kept the first place, running light and with her breath easy, for Ugh-lomi carried the firestone in his hand. It told on his pace, not at first, but after a time. Ugh-lomi's footsteps behind Eudena suddenly grew remote. Glancing over her shoulder as they crossed another open space, Eudena saw that Ugh-lomi was many yards behind her, and Ouya close upon him, with antler already raised in the air to strike him down. Wau and the others were but just emerging from the shadow of the woods. Seeing Ugh-lomi in peril, Eudena ran sideways, looking back, threw up her arms, and cried aloud just as the antler flew. And young Ugh-lomi, expecting this and understanding her cry, ducked his head, so that the missile merely struck his scalp lightly, making but a trivial wound, and flew over him. He turned forthwith, the quartzite firestone in both hands, and hurled it straight at Ouya's body as he ran loose from the throw. Ouya shouted, but could not dodge it. It took him under the ribs, heavy and flat, and he reeled, and went down without a cry. Ugh-lomi caught up the antler. One tine of it was tipped with his own blood, and came running on again with a red trickle just coming out of his hair. Ouya rolled over twice and lay a moment before he got up, and then he did not run so fast. The color of his face was changed. Wau overtook him, then the others, and he coughed and labored in his breath, but he kept on. At last the 2 fugitives gained the bank of the river, where the stream ran deep and narrow. They still had 50 yards in hand of Wau, the foremost pursuer, and the man who made the smiting stones. Wau carried one, a large flint, the shape of an oyster and double the size, chipped to a chisel edge in either hand. They sprang down deep bank into the stream, washed through the water, swam the deep current in 2 or 3 strokes, and came out wading again, dripping and refreshed to clamber up the farther bank. It was undermined, with willows growing thickly therefrom, so that it needed clambering. And while Eudena was still among the silvery branches, Ugh-lomi still in the water, for the antler had encumbered him, Wau came up against the sky on the opposite bank, and the smiting stone, thrown cunningly, took the side of Eudena's knee. She struggled to the top and fell. They heard the pursuers shout to one another, And Ugh-lomi, climbing to her and moving jerkily to mar Wau's aim, felt the second smiting stone graze his ear, and he heard the water splashing below him. And then it was Ugh-lomi. The stripling proved himself to have come to a man's estate, for running on, he found Eudena fell behind, limping, and at that he turned. Crying savagely, with a face terrible with sudden wrath and trickling blood, he ran swiftly past her back to the bank, whirling the antler round his head. Eudena kept on running stoutly still, though she must needs limp at every step, and the pain was already sharp. So that Wau, rising over the edge and clutching the straight willow branches, saw Ugh-lomi towering over him, gigantic against the blue, saw his whole body swing round. The grip of his hand came down upon the antler. The edge of the antler came sweeping through the air, and he saw no more. The water under the osiers whirled and eddied, went crimson 6 feet down the stream. Uya, following, stopped knee-high across the stream, and the man who was swimming turned about. The other men who trailed after, they were none of them very mighty men, for Uya was more cunning than strong, brooking no sturdy rivals, you see. The other men trailed and slackened momentarily at the sight of Ugh-lomi, standing there above the willows, bloody and terrible, between them and the halting girl with the huge antler waving in his hand. It seemed as though he had gone into the water a youth and come out of it a man full grown. He knew what there was behind him, a broad stretch of grass and then a thicket in that Eudena could hide. That was clear in his mind, though his thinking powers were too feeble to see what would happen thereafter. Uya stood knee-deep, undecided and unarmed. His heavy mouth hung open, showing his canine teeth. He panted heavily. His side was flushed and bruised under the hair. The other man beside him carried a sharpened stick. The rest of the hunters came up one by one to the top of the bank. Hairy, long-armed men clutching flints and sticks. 2 ran off along the bank down the stream, and then clambered down to the water, where Wau had come to the surface, struggling weakly. They gibbered at him without any sane attempt to help, and presently he went under again. 2 others threatened Ugh-lomi from the bank. He answered back, shouts, vague insult, gestures. Then Uya, who had been standing hesitating, roared with rage, and whirling his fist, came plunging through the water, his followers splashing after him. Ugh-lomi glanced over his shoulder and found Eudena already vanished into the thicket. He would perhaps have waited for Uya, but Uya preferred to spar in the water below him until the others were beside him. Human tactics in those days, in all serious fighting, were, well, the tactics of the pack. Prey that turned at bay, they gathered around and rushed. Ugh-lomi felt the rush coming, and hurling the antler at Uya, turned about and fled. When he halted to look back from the shadow of the thicket, he found only 3 of his pursuers had followed him across the river, and they were going back again. Uya, with a bleeding mouth, was on the farther side of the stream again, but lower down. He held his hand to his side. The others were in the river, dragging something to shore. For a time, at least, the chase was intermitted. Ugh-lomi stood a-watching for a space, and snarled at the sight of Uya. Then he turned and plunged into the thicket. In a minute, Eudena came hastening to join him, and they went on hand in hand. He dimly perceived the pain she suffered from the cut and bruised knee, and chose the easier ways. But they went on all that day, mile after mile, through wood and thicket, until at last they came to the chalkland, open grass with rare woods of beech, and the birch growing near water. And they saw the wealded mountains nearer, and groups of horses grazing together. They went circumspectly, keeping always near the thicket and cover, for this was a strange region, even its ways were strange. Steadily the ground rose until the chestnut forest spread wide and blue below them, and the Thames marshes shone silvery and high and far. They saw no men here, for in those days men were still only just come into this part of the world, were moving but slowly along the riverways. Towards evening they came on the river again, but now it ran in a gorge between high cliffs of white chalk that sometimes overhung it. Down the cliffs was a scrub of birches, and there were many birds down there, and the ubiquitous river otters, of course. And high up on the cliff was a little shelf by a tree, whereon they clambered to pass the night. The 2 had had scarcely any food. It was not the time of year for berries, and they had no time to go aside to snare or waylay. They tramped in a hungry, weary silence, gnawing at twigs and leaves. But over the surface of the cliffs were a multitude of snails, and in bush there were freshly laid eggs of a little bird. Then Ugh-lomi threw at and killed a squirrel in a beech tree, so at last they fed well. Ugh-lomi watched during the night, his chin on his knees, and he heard young foxes crying hard by, the noise of mammoths down the gorge, and the hyenas yelling and laughing far away. It was chilly, but they dared not light a fire. Whenever he dozed, his spirit went abroad, and straightway met with the spirit of Uya, and they fought. And always Ugh-lomi was paralyzed so that he could not smite or run, and he would wake suddenly. Eudena, too, dreamt evil things of Uya, so that they both awoke with a fear of him in their hearts. By the light of the dawn, they saw a woolly rhinoceros go blundering down the valley. During the day, they caressed one another and were glad of the sunshine. Eudena's leg was so stiff she sat on the ledge all day. Ugh-lomi found great flints sticking out of the cliff face, greater than any he had ever seen. He dragged some to the ledge and began chipping, so as to be armed against Uya when he came again. And at one he laughed heartily, and Eudena laughed, and they threw it about in derision. This big flint had a hole in it. They stuck their fingers through it. It was very funny indeed. And they peeped at one another through the hole in the stone. Afterwards, Ugh-lomi got himself a stick, and thrusting by chance at this foolish flint, the stick went in and stuck there. He had rammed it in too tightly to withdraw it. That was still stranger, scarcely funny, terrible almost, and for a time Ugh-lomi did not greatly care to touch the thing. It was as if the flint had bit and held that stick with its teeth. But then he got familiar with the odd combination. He swung it about and perceived dimly that the stick with the heavy stone on the end struck a better blow than anything he knew. He went to and fro swinging it and striking with it. But later he tired of it and threw it aside. In the afternoon he went up over the brow of the white cliff and lay watching by a rabbit warren until the rabbits came out to play. There were no men thereabouts. The rabbits were heedless. He threw a smiting stone he had made and got a kill. That night they made a fire from flint sparks and bracken fronds, and they talked and they caressed by it. In their sleep Uya's spirit came again, and suddenly, while Ugh-lomi was trying to fight vainly, the foolish flint on the stick came into his hand in his dream, and he struck Uya with it, and behold, it killed him. But afterwards came other dreams of Uya, for spirits take a lot of killing, and he had to be killed again and again. And then after that the stone would not keep on the stick. Ugh-lomi woke tired and rather gloomy. He was so sulky all the forenoon in spite of Eudena's kindliness, and instead of hunting he sat chipping on a sharp edge with a singular flint, and looking strangely at Eudena. Then Ugh-lomi bound the perforated flint onto the stick with the strips of rabbit, and afterwards he walked up and down the ledge, striking with it, muttering to himself, thinking of Uya. It felt very fine and very heavy in his hand. Several days, more than there was any counting in those days, 5 days it may be, or 6, did Ugh-lomi and Eudena stay on that shelf in the gorge of the river. And they lost all fear of men, and their fire burnt redly of a night, and they were very merry together. There was food every day, sweet water, no enemies. Eudena's knee was well in a couple of days, for those ancient savages had quick healing flesh. Indeed, the couple was very happy. On one of those days, although it has little to do with this story, Ugh-lomi dropped a chunk of flint on the cliff. He saw it fall and go bounding across the river bank into the river, and after laughing and thinking it over a little while, he tried another. This smashed a bush of hazel in the most interesting way. They spent all the morning dropping stones from the ledge, and in the afternoon they discovered this new and interesting pastime was also possible from the cliff brow. The next day they had forgot this delight, or at least it seemed they had forgotten. But Uya came in dreams to spoil the paradise. 3 nights he came fighting Ugh-lomi. In the morning after these dreams, Ugh-lomi would walk up and down, threatening him, swinging the axe, and at last came the night after Ugh-lomi brained the otter, and they had feasted, Uya went too far. Ugh-lomi awoke, scowling under his heavy brows, and he took his axe, and extending his hands towards Eudena, he made her wait for him upon the ledge. Then he clambered down the white declivity, glanced up once from the foot of it, and flourished his axe, and without looking back again, went striding along the river bank until the overhanging cliff at the bend hit him. 2 days and nights did Eudena sit alone by the fire on the ledge waiting, and in the night the beasts howled over the cliffs and down the valley, and on the cliff over against her hunched the hyenas prowled black against the sky. But no evil thing came near her, save fear. And once far away she heard a roaring of a lion, followed following the horses as they came northward over the grasslands with the spring. All that time she waited, waiting that its pain. And the third day Ugh-lomi came back up the river. The plumes of a raven were in his hair, the axe was red-stained and had long dark hairs upon it. He carried the necklace that had marked the favorite of Uya in his hand. Ugh-lomi walked in the soft places, giving no heed to his trail. Save a raw cut below his jaw, there was not a wound upon him. "Uya!" cried Ugh-lomi, exultant. And Eudena saw it was well. Ugh-lomi put the necklace on Eudena then, and they ate and they drank together, and were cheerful. And after eating, he began to rehearse the whole story from the beginning. When Uya had cast his eyes on Eudena, and Uya and Ugh-lomi, fighting in the forest, had been chased by the bear, eking out his scanty words with abundant pantomime, springing to his feet and whirling the stone axe round when it came to the fighting. The last fight, indeed, was a mighty one, stamping and shouting, and once a blow with the fire that sent a torrent of sparks up into the night. Eudena sat red in the light of the fire, gloating on him, her face flushed and her eyes shining, and the necklace Uya had made about her neck. Oh, it was a splendid time, and the stars that looked down on us looked down on her, our ancestor, who's been dead now these 50,000 years. Now, in the days when Eudena and Ugh-lomi fled from the people of Uya toward the fir-clad mountains of the Weald, across the forests of sweet chestnut and the grass-clad chalkland, and hid themselves at last in the gorge of the river between the chalk cliffs, men were few and their squatting places far between. The nearest men to them were those of the tribe. A full day's journey down the river and up the mountains there were none. Man was indeed a newcomer to this part of the world in that very ancient time, coming slowly along the rivers, generation after generation, from one squatting place to another, from the south westward. And the animals that held the land, the hippopotami and the rhinoceroses of the river valleys, and the horses of the grass plains, the deer and the swine of the woods, the grey apes in the branches, the otters of the rivers, the cattle of the uplands. Oh, they all feared him but little, let alone the mammoths in the mountains and the elephants that came to the land in the summer-time out of the south. For why should they fear man, with but the rough chipped flints that he had not learned to haft, which he threw but ill, and the poor spear of sharpened wood, as all his weapons against hoof and horn and tooth and claw? Andu, the huge cave bear, who lived in the cave up the gorge, as some people would say, had never even seen a white man in all his wise and respectable life until midway through one night, as Andu was prowling down the gorge along the cliff edge, he saw the glare of Eudena's fire upon the ledge, and Eudena, red and shining, and Ugh-lomi with a gigantic shadow mocking him upon the white cliff, going to and fro, shaking his mane of hair, waving the axe of stone, the very first axe of stone, while he chanted of the killing of Uya. Now the cave bear was far up the gorge, and he saw the thing slanting ways and far off. He was so surprised he stood quite still upon the edge, sniffing the novel odor of burning bracken, and wondering whether the dawn was coming up in the wrong place. He was the lord of the rocks and the caves, was the cave bear, as his slight brother, the grizzly, was lord of the thick woods below, and as the dappled lion, the lion of those days was dappled, was lord of the thorn thickets, reed beds, and open plains. He was the greatest of all meat-eaters. He knew no fear. None preyed upon him. None gave him battle. Only the rhinoceros was beyond his strength. Even the mammoth shunned his country. This invasion perplexed him. He noticed these new beasts were shaped like monkeys and sparsely hairy like young pigs. Monkey and young pig, said the cave bear. It might not be so bad. But that red thing that jumps, that black thing jumping with it yonder. Never in my life have I seen such things before. He came slowly along the brow of the cliff towards them, stopping thrice to sniff and peer, and the reek of the fire grew stronger. A couple of hyenas were so intent upon the thing below that Andu, coming soft and easy, was close upon them before they knew of him or he of them. They started guiltily and went lurching off. Coming around in a wheel, 100 yards off, they began yelling and calling him names for the start they had had.
Who can't grub his own burrow? Who eats roots like a pig? Ha 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 ha!
For even in those days, the hyenas' manners were just as offensive as they are now. "Who answers a hyena?" growled Andu, peering through the midnight dimness at them and then going over the cliff's edge. There was Ugh-lomi still telling his story, the fire getting low and the scent of the burning hot and strong. Andu stood on the edge of the cliff for some time, shifting his vast weight from foot to foot and swaying his head to and fro. His mouth hanging open, his ears erect and twitching, the nostrils of his big black muzzle sniffing. He was very curious, was this cave bear, more curious than any of the bears that lived now. And the flickering fire and the incomprehensible movements of the man, let alone the intrusion into his indisputable province, stirred him in the sense of strange happenings. Andu had been after the red deer fawn that night, for the cave bear was a miscellaneous hunter. But this quite turned for that enterprise. Yelled the hyenas behind him. Peering through the starlight, Andu saw there were now 3 or 4 going to and fro against the grey hillside. "Mama! They will hang about me now all night until I kill," said Andu. "Mah! Filth of the world." And mainly to annoy them, he resolved to watch the red flicker in the gorge until the dawn came to drive the hyena scum home. And after a time they vanished, and he heard their voices like a party of cockney bean feasters away in the beech woods. Then came slinking near again. Andu yawned and went on along the cliff, and they followed. Then he stopped and went back. It was a splendid night, beset with shining constellations, the same stars, but not the same constellations we know. For since those days, all the stars have had time to move into new places. Far away across the open space beyond, where the heavy-shouldered, lean-bodied hyenas blundered and howled, was a beechwood. The mountain slopes rose beyond, a dim mystery, until the snow-capped summits came out white and cold and clear, touched by the first rays of the yet unseen moon. It was a vast silence, save when the yell of the hyenas flung a vanishing discordance across its peace, or when, from down the hills, the trumpeting of the new-come elephants came faintly on the breeze. And below now, the red flicker had dwindled and was steady, and shone a deeper red. Ugh-lomi had finished his story and was preparing to sleep, and Eudena sat and listened to the strange voices of unknown beasts, and watched the dark eastern sky growing deeply luminous at the advent of the moon. Down below, the river talked to itself, and things unseen went to and fro. After a time, the bear went away, but in an hour he was back again, and then, as if struck by a thought, he turned and went up the gorge. The night passed, Ugh-lomi slept on. The waning moon rose and lit the gaunt white cliff overhead with a light that was pale and vague. The gorge remained in deeper shadow and seemed all the darker. Then by imperceptible degrees the day came stealing in the wake of the moonlight. Eudena's eyes wandered to the cliff brow overhead once again, and then again. Each time the line was sharp and clear against the sky. And yet, she had a dim perception of something lurking there. The red of the fire grew deeper and deeper. Grey scales spread upon it. Its vertical column of smoke became more and more visible. And up and down the gorge, things that had been unseen grew clear in a colorless illumination. She may have dozed then. Suddenly she started up from her squatting position, erect and alert, scrutinizing the cliff up and down. She made the faintest sound. Ugh-lomi, too, light sleeping like an animal, was instantly awake. He caught up his axe and came noiselessly to Eudena's side. The light was still dim, the world now all in black and dark grey, and one sickly star still lingered overhead. The ledge they were on was a little grassy space, 6 feet wide, perhaps 20 feet long, sloping outwardly, with a handful of St. John's wort growing near the edge. Below it, the soft white rock fell away in a steep slope of nearly 50 feet to a thick bush of hazel that fringed the river. Down the river this slope increased, until some way off a thin grass held its own right up to the crest of the cliff. Overhead 40 or 50 feet of rock bulged into the great masses characteristic of chalk, but at the end of the ledge a gully, a precipitous groove of discolored chalk slashed down the face of the cliff, gave footing to a scrubby growth by which Eudena and Ugh-lomi went up and down. They stood as noiseless as startled deer, with their every sense expectant. For a minute they heard nothing. And then came a faint rattling of dust down the gully and the creaking of twigs. Ugh-lomi gripped his axe, went to the edge of the ledge, and where the bulge of the chalk overhead had hidden up the upper part of the gully. And forthwith, with a sudden contraction of the heart, Ugh-lomi saw the cave bear halfway down from the brow, and making a gingerly backward step with his flat hind foot. His hindquarters were toward Ugh-lomi, and he clawed at the rocks and bushes so that he seemed flattened against the cliff. He looked none the less for that. From his shining snout to his stumpy tail, he was lion and a half, the length of 2 tall men. He looked over his shoulder. His huge mouth was open with the exertion of holding up his great carcass. His tongue lay out. He got his footing, and he came down slowly, a yard nearer. "There!" said Ugh-lomi, looking round with his face white. But Eudena, with terror in her eyes, was pointing down the cliff. Ugh-lomi's mouth fell open, for down below, with her big forefeet against the rock, stood another big grey bulk, the she-bear. She was not so big as Andu, but she was still big enough for all that. Then suddenly Ugh-lomi gave a cry, and catching up a handful of the litter of ferns that lay scattered on the ledge, he thrust into the pallid ash of the fire. "Brother Fire! Brother Fire!" And Eudena, starting into action, did likewise.
Brother Fire! Brother Fire, help! Help us, Brother Fire!
Brother Fire was still red in his heart. But he turned to grey as they scattered him.
Brother Fire!
They screamed. But he whispered and passed, and there was nothing but ashes. Then Ugh-lomi danced with anger and struck the ashes with his fist. But Eudena began to hammer the firestone against a flint, and the eyes of each were turning ever again towards the gully by which Andu was climbing down. Ah, Brother Fire! Suddenly the huge furry hindquarters of the bear came into view beneath the bulge of the chalk that had hidden him. He was still clambering gingerly down the nearly vertical surface. His head was yet out of sight. They could hear him talking to himself. Pig and monkey, ma! Pig and monkey, it ought to be good. Ma! Eudena struck a spark and blew at it. It twinkled brighter and then went out. At that she cast down flint and firestone and began wringing her hands. Her face was wet with tears. Then she sprang to her feet and scrambled a dozen feet up the cliff above the ledge. How she hung on for even a moment I do not know, for the chalk was vertical, without grip for a monkey. In a couple of seconds Eudena had slid back to the ledge, again with bleeding hands. Ugh-lomi was making frantic rushes about the ledge. Now he would go to the edge, now to the gully. He did not know what to do. He could not think. The she-bear looked smaller than her mate, much. If they rushed down on her together, one might live. "Hey!" said the cave bear. And Ugh-lomi turned again and saw little eyes peering under the bulge of the chalk. "Wow! Stand away!" said the bear. "I am going to jump down." Eudena, cowering at the end of the ledge, began to scream like a gripped rabbit. At that a sort of madness came upon Ugh-lomi. With a mighty cry he caught up his axe and began to clamber up the gully to the bear. He uttered neither word nor cry. The monster gave a grunt of surprise. In a moment Ugh-lomi was clinging to a bush right underneath the bear, and in another he was hanging onto its back, half buried in fur, with one fist clutched in the hair under its jaw. The bear was too astonished at this fantastic attack to do more than cling passive. And then the axe, that first of all axes, rang into the bear's skull. The bear's head twisted from side to side, began a petulant, scolding growl. The axe bit within an inch of the left eye, and the hot blood blinded that side. At that the brutes roared with surprise and anger. His teeth gnashed 6 inches from Ugh-lomi's face. Then the axe, clubbed close, came down heavily on the corner of the jaw. The next blow blinded the right side and called forth a roar, this time of pain. Eudena saw the huge flat feet slipping and sliding, and suddenly the bear gave a clumsy leap sideways, as if for the ledge. Then everything vanished. The hazels smashed, a roar of pain, a tumult of shouts and growls came up from far below. Eudena screamed and ran to the edge and peered over. For a moment man and bears were a heap together, Ugh-lomi uppermost, and then he had sprung clear and was scaling the gully again, with the bears rolling and striking at one another among the hazels. But he had left his axe below, and the 3 knob-ended streaks of carmine were shooting down his thigh. "Up!" he cried. In a moment Eudena was preceding him up to the top of the cliff. In half a minute they were at the crest, their hearts pumping noisily, with Andu and his wife far and safe below them. Andu was sitting on his haunches, both paws at work, trying with quick, exasperated movements to wipe the blindness out of his eyes, and the she-bear stood on all fours a little ways off, ruffled in appearance and growling angrily. Ugh-lomi flung himself flat on the grass and lay panting and bleeding with his face on his arms. For a second, Eudena regarded the bears, then she came and sat beside him, looking at him. Presently, she put forth her hand timidly and touched him, and made the guttural sound that was his name. He turned over and raised himself on his arm. His face was pale, like the face of one who was afraid. He looked at her steadfastly for a moment. Then suddenly he laughed. He said exultantly. Said she. A simple but expressive conversation. Then Ugh-lomi came and knelt beside her, and on hands and knees peered over the brow and examined the gorge. His breath was steady now. The blood on his leg had ceased to flow, though the scratches the she-bear had made were open and wide. He squatted up and sat staring at the footmarks of the great bears that came to the gully. They were as wide as his head and twice as long. Then he jumped up and went along the cliff face until the ledge was visible. Here he sat down for some time thinking, while Eudena watched him. At last Ugh-lomi rose, as one whose mind is made up. He returned toward the gully, Eudena keeping close by him, and together they clambered to the ledge. They took the firestone and a flint. Then Ugh-lomi went down to the foot of the cliff very cautiously and found his axe. They returned to the cliff now as quietly as they could, turning their faces resolutely upstream, set off at a brisk walk. The ledge was clearly a home no longer, with such callers as those of the neighborhood. Not family-friendly, and they don't make good pets. Ugh-lomi carried the axe and Eudena the firestone. So simple was a Paleolithic removal. They went upstream, although it might lead to the very lair of the cave bear, because there was no other way to go. Down the stream was the tribe, and had not Ugh-lomi killed Uya and Wa'u? By the stream they had to keep, because of drinking. That's true. Many houses are broken by bears, but bears are not broken by houses. That's a Neolithic wisdom. They went upstream, although it might lead to the very lair of the cave bear. They followed the stream, and so they marched through the beech trees, with the gorge deepening until the river flowed, a frothing rapid 500 feet below them, and all of the changeful things in this world of change, the courses of rivers in deep valleys, change least. It was the river way. In fact, the river we know today. They marched over the very spots where nowadays stand little Guildford and Godalming, the first human beings to come into the land. Once a grey ape chattered and vanished, and all along the cliff edge, vast and even, ran the spoor of the great cave bear. Then the spoor of the bear fell away from the cliff, showing, Ugh-lomi thought, that he came from some place to the left, and keeping to the cliff's edge, they presently came to an end. They found themselves looking down on a great semicircular space caused by the collapse of the cliff. It smashed right across the gorge, banking the upstream water back in a pool which overflowed at a rapid. The slip had happened long ago. It was grassed over, but the face of the cliffs that stood about the semicircle was still almost fresh-looking and white as on the day when the rock must have broken and slid down. Starkly exposed and black under the foot of these cliffs were the mouths of several caves, and as they stood there looking at the space, disinclined to skirt it, because they thought the bear's lair lay somewhere on the left in the direction they must needs take, they saw suddenly first one bear, and then two coming up the grass slope to the right and going across the amphitheater towards the caves. Andu was first. He dropped a little on his forefoot, and his mien was despondent, and the she-bear came shuffling along behind. Eudena and Ugh-lomi stepped quite noiselessly back from the cliff until they could just see the bears on the verge. Then Ugh-lomi stopped. Eudena pulled his arm, and he turned with a forbidding gesture, and her hand dropped. Ugh-lomi stood there watching the bears with his axe in his hand until they had vanished into the cave. He growled softly. He shook the axe at the she-bear's receding quarters. And then, quite to Eudena's terror, instead of creeping off with her, Ugh-lomi lay flat down and crawled forwards into such a position they could see just the cave. It was bears, and he did it as calmly as if it had been rabbits he was watching. He lay still, like a barked log, sun dappled in the shadow of the trees. He was thinking. And Eudena had learnt, even when a little girl, that when Ugh-lomi became still like that, jawbone on his fist, novel things presently began to happen. It was an hour before the thinking was over. It was noon when the two little savages had found their way to the cliff brow that overhung the bear's cave, and all the long afternoon they fought desperately with great boulders of chalk, trundling it with nothing but their unaided sturdy muscles, from the gully where it had hung like a loose tooth towards the cliff top. It was a full 2 yards about it. It stood as high as Eudena's waist. It was a obtuse angled and toothed with flints. And when the sun set, it was poised, 3 inches above from the edge, above the cave of the great cave bear. And Yukon Cornelius and Clarice and Rudolph were trapped inside. Wait, that's a different story. Sorry. In the cave, conversation languished during the afternoon. Well, it's 8 o'clock. We still have a few minutes left. We want to hear this, don't we? There's a dentist when you need one. In the cave, conversation languished during the afternoon. The she-bear snoozed sulkily in her corner, for she was fond of pig and monkey. And Andu was busy licking the side of his paw and smearing his face to cool the smart inflammation of his wounds. Afterwards he went and sat just within the mouth of the cave, blinking out at the afternoon sun with an uninjured eye, and thinking. I never was so startled in all my life. They are most extraordinary beasts, attacking me.
I don't like them,
said the she-bear out of the darkness behind.
A feebler sort of beast I never saw. I can't think what the world is coming to. Scraggy, weedy legs. I wonder how they keep warm in the winter.
Oh, very likely they don't,
said the she-bear.
I suppose it's a sort of monkey gone wrong.
Meh, it's a change,
said the she-bear. A pause.
The advantage he had was merely accidental. These things will happen at times.
I can't understand why you let it go,
said the she-bear. That matter had been discussed before and settled. So Andu, being a bear of experience, remained silent for a space, then resumed upon a different aspect of a matter.
He has a sort of claw, a long claw that he seemed to have first on one paw and then the other. Just one claw. One. They're very odd things. That bright thing, too, they seem to have, like that glare that comes in the sky in the daytime, only it jumps about it. It's really worth seeing. It's a thing with a root, too, like grass when it's windy.
Oh, does it bite? If it bites, it can't be a plant, you know.
No? I don't know. But it's curious anyhow.
Oh, I wonder if they're good eating. I suppose we won't know now.
Well, they look like good eating,
said Andu with an appetite. For the cave bear, like the polar bear, was an incurable carnivore. No roots or honey for him. The two bears fell into meditation for a space. Andu resumed his simple attentions to his eye. The sunlight lit up the green slope before the cave mouth grew warmer in tone and warmer until it was a ruddy amber.
Curious sort of thing. Day. Lot too much of it, I think. Quite unsuitable for hunting. Dazzles me always. I can't smell nearly so well by day.
You don't smell well at night, either.
Other than that, the she-bear did not answer. There came a measured crunching sound out of the darkness. She turned up a bone. Andu yawned.
Well,
he strolled to the cave mouth and stood with his head projecting, surveying the amphitheater. He found he had to turn his head completely round to see objects on his right hand. No doubt that eye would be all right tomorrow, I hope. He yawned again. There was a tap overhead. A tap, and then a big mass of chalk flew out from the cliff face, dropped a yard in front of his nose, and starred into a dozen unequal fragments. It startled him extremely. When he had recovered from
A little from his shock, he went and sniffed curiously at the representative pieces of the fallen projectile. They had a distinctive flavor, oddly reminiscent of the two drab animals of the ledge. Andrew sat up and pawed the larger lump, walked around it several times, trying to find a man about it somewhere. When night had come, he went off down the river gorge to see if he could cut off either of the ledge's occupants. The ledge was empty, of course. There were no signs of the red thing either. But as he was rather hungry, he did not loiter along that night, but pushed on to pick up a red deer fawn. He forgot about the drab animals. He found a fawn. The doe was close by and made an ugly fight for her young. Andrew had to leave the fawn. But as her blood was up, she struck to the attack. At last he got in a blow of his paw at her nose, and so got hold of her. More meat, but less delicacy. And the she-bear following had her share. The next afternoon, curiously enough, the very fellow of the first white rock fell, and smashed precisely according to the precedent. Now the aim of the third falling rock, that night, fell the night after, however, was better. It hit Andrew's unspeculative skull with a crack that echoed up the cliff, and the white fragments went dancing to all the points of the compass. The she-bear, coming after him and sniffing curiously at him, found him lying in an odd sort of attitude with his head wet and all out of shape. Now she was a young she-bear and inexperienced, and having sniffed about him for some time and licked him a little and so forth, she decided to leave him until the odd mood had passed and went on her hunting alone. She looked up the fawn of the red doe they had killed 2 nights ago and found it. It was lonely hunting without Andrew, and she returned caveward before dawn. The sky was grey and overcast. The trees up the gorge were black and unfamiliar, and into her ursine mind came a dim sense of strange and dreary happenings. She lifted up her voice and called Andrew by name.
Andrew! Andrew!
The sides of the gorge re-echoed her. As she approached the cave, she saw in the half-light and heard a couple of jackals scuttle off, and immediately after a hyena howled and a dozen clumsy bulks went lumbering up the slope and stopped and yelled derision.
Lord of the rocks and caves!
These came down the wind to her. The dismissal feeling in the she-bear's mind became suddenly acute. She shuffled across the amphitheater. And the hyenas retreating. The cave bear was not lying quite in the same attitude, because the hyenas had been busy, hadn't they? And in one place his ribs showed white. Dotted over the turf about him lay the smashed fragments of the 3 great lumps of chalk, and the air was full of the scent of death. The she-bear stopped dead. Even now, that the great and wonderful Andrew was killed was beyond her believing. And then she heard far overhead a queer sound, a little like the shout of a hyena, but fuller and lower in pitch. She looked up with her little dawn-blinded eyes, seeing little, her nostrils quivering, and there on the cliff edge, far above her against the bright pink of dawn, were those 2 little shaggy, round, dark things, the heads of Eudena and Ugh-lomi, as they shouted derision down to her. So though she could not see them very distinctly, she could hear. And dimly, she began to apprehend. A novel feeling as of imminent strange evils came into her heart then. She began to examine the smashed fragments of chalk that lay about Andrew. For a space she stood still, looking about her, making a low, continuous sound that was almost a moan. Then she went back incredulously to Andrew to make one last effort to rouse him. You've just heard The Stone Age by H.G. Wells. Please join us again for the exciting conclusion. Thank you for listening to StoryLink Radio. If you like what you've just heard, we hope you will subscribe to our podcast and pass along our web address, www.storylinkradio.com. Be sure to visit our website for show notes, to find out how to join our live audience, and for lots of free stuff, including free audiobooks and much more. Join us next time for another story from StoryLink Radio.